Welcome to Drew's Storytime. If you enjoy falling asleep here, you're very welcome to subscribe for more gentle stories and peaceful meditations. Whether you're sitting or lying down, just allow yourself to get comfortable and let tonight's story carry you gently into rest. Tonight's story is When the Tide Paused. The tide was further out than Mark expected. At first, the difference registered only as a faint unease in scale, the shoreline stretching wider than his memory allowed. The beach felt larger, its openness exaggerated by the way the water had withdrawn, leaving behind a broad expanse of damp sand that reflected the sky in dull, shifting patches. Mark stood for a moment at the edge of it, hands in his coat pockets, allowing his eyes to adjust to the altered proportions. The morning was cool without being sharp. A thin veil of cloud hung high above, diffusing the light until it lost any clear direction. There were no harsh shadows, no glare off the water. Everything appeared evenly lit, as though the day had decided to begin quietly, without emphasis. The air carried the faint scent of salt and stone, clean and understated. Mark stepped onto the sand and felt it give slightly beneath his shoes. The surface held the imprint of the tide's recent passage. Shallow channels ran in loose, wandering lines toward the distant water. Their edges softened where the last wave had passed. Between them, darker patches of sand marked places where the sea had lingered before retreating. Each feature felt provisional, as though the beach had not yet decided what shape it wished to hold. He walked slowly, not because the ground required caution, but because the space encouraged it. There was no need to reach the water. The distance between land and sea had stretched far enough that movement felt optional rather than purposeful. Mark let his pace settle into something unmeasured, guided less by intention than by inclination. The sound of the sea was present but subdued. Waves still arrived and withdrew, though the rhythm had softened, the impact diminished by distance. What reached him was a low murmur rather than a crash, a steady breathing sound that blended easily with the quiet of the morning. The beach absorbed it without echo. Mark stopped near one of the shallow pools left behind by the retreating tide. It was no larger than a table, its edges irregular, its surface still. The water inside was clear enough to reveal the stones beneath, each one smoothed by time and movement. Greys and browns dominated, interrupted occasionally by pale stripes or darker flecks. A thin strand of seaweed lay partially submerged, its slow drift barely perceptible. He crouched and rested his weight on his heels. From this angle, the pool reflected the sky as clearly as it revealed its content. The boundary between reflection and depth blurred, making it difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. The distinction felt unnecessary. Both existed at once, complete in themselves. A faint breeze crossed the surface. The water trembled briefly, the reflection breaking into fragments before settling again. The stones beneath did not move. The strand of seaweed adjusted slightly, then stilled. The pool accepted the disturbance without retaining it. Mark remained where he was. The moment did not ask for interpretation. It did not present itself as significant. It simply held his attention without effort. His breathing slowed to match the quiet rhythm of the place, each inhale and exhale unforced. He stood and continued along the beach, following one of the shallow channels as it curved toward the sea. The sand here bore patterns formed by the retreating water, fine ridges repeated across the surface, similar but never identical, their lines recording movement rather than intention. The beach carried the memory of the tide without trying to preserve it. Everything here felt temporary, though nothing felt fragile. As he walked, Mark noticed the absence of urgency. The day before had been full in the way most days were, shaped by tasks that demanded attention and responses that arrived faster than thought. The beach offered no such demands. Time did not compress here. It widened. He paused again and looked across the exposed shore. The distance to the water felt deliberate, as though the sea had chosen this moment to step back and reveal what usually remained hidden. Pools glinted softly across the sand, each one holding a small, contained version of the sky. None competed for attention. Together, they formed a quiet field of reflections. Mark felt a subtle release in his chest. Not relief exactly, not a gentle easing of internal pressure, as though something had been loosened without being removed. The pause of the tide mirrored something in him, a brief suspension between movements that usually followed too closely to be noticed. He walked on, his footprints appearing behind him, dark and precise in the damp sand. They looked temporary, even as they formed. He knew the returning tide would erase them later, smoothing the surface back into something unmarked. The thought did not diminish the act of walking. It made it lighter. The air carried a faint chill now, enough to be felt without discomfort. Mark zipped his coat higher and continued along the line where sand met stone. Here the ground shifted subtly underfoot, firmer and more textured. Small shells lay scattered among the pebbles, their surfaces dulled by water and time. He bent to pick one up. It was pale and smooth, its shape asymmetrical, worn more by erosion than design. Mark turned it over once in his fingers, then set it back where he found it. The gesture felt complete, without needing repetition. For a while, nothing changed. The sea remained distant. The light held steady. The pools continued to reflect. The pause persisted, without announcing itself. Mark stood within it, unhurried, attentive, aware that the moment would end without requiring him to acknowledge its passing. Eventually, he became aware of the faintest shift. The sound of the water grew marginally louder, not enough to demand attention, but enough to suggest movement. The tide had begun its return, though the change was still too gradual to see. Mark turned back toward the land. The beach behind him appeared unchanged, yet he knew the pause would not last. The pools would be reclaimed. The channels would disappear. The wide openness would narrow again into the familiar meeting of sea and shore. He walked back across the sand, carrying nothing with him but the quiet that had settled. The tide would return in its own time. The pause had been enough. The change became easier to hear than to see. As Mark walked, the murmur of the sea thickened slightly, as if the water had moved closer, while his attention rested elsewhere. The beach still looked wide, the distance still vast, yet sound carried information that sight did not. Mark stopped near another pool, smaller than the first. It rested in a shallow hollow, where sand dipped unevenly, its edges lined with tiny pebbles pressed into place by the last retreat. The surface remained calm, holding a muted reflection of cloud. A gull called once, then fell silent. The sound traveled across the open sand and vanished without echo. Mark listened for a second call, that never came. The stillness returned immediately, as though the beach had decided that a single note was sufficient. He continued along the channel he had followed earlier. The ridges in the sand remained crisp enough to read. Each one caught the light differently. Some edges faintly highlighted, others dissolving into darker patches. The beach offered detail without insisting it be noticed. As he walked, Mark became aware of how his body had settled. Shoulders lower, jaw unclenched, hands resting more loosely in his pockets. The change had not come from effort. It had been granted by the pace of the place, the quiet agreement that nothing needed to be hurried into completion. Eventually, he reached the point where wet sand turned glossier beneath his feet. A thin film of water reflected the sky, a faint mirror that broke under each step and reformed behind him. Mark slowed instinctively, mindful of the subtle shift in texture. In the distance, the sea's edge had moved. Not dramatically, but enough to notice once he looked for it. Small waves crept forward, spreading thin sheens across the sand before drawing back again. Mark stood and watched. He did not feel the need to step closer. A wave rolled in quietly. The next followed, reaching slightly farther than the last. The pools around him remained, though their edges began to soften. Water seeped into the shallow channels, filling them in slow lines that traveled toward the hollows. The change was subtle and patient, as if the tide were repairing what it had exposed. Mark felt a brief urge to hold the moment, not to stop the tide, but to preserve the clarity he had found in the pause. The urge arrived quietly and faded just as gently. The return was part of the meaning. Stillness mattered because it ended. He turned away and began walking back toward the path. His footprints appeared briefly in the damp sand, then softened as a thin sheet of water passed over them. The tide erased without violence, smoothing and reclaiming in the most ordinary way possible. By the time he reached the edge of the sand where grass began again, the air felt slightly warmer. Mark paused once more before stepping onto the path and looked back across the shore that was already narrowing. The pools still glinted faintly. The channels still held their lines. The tide continued its slow return. Mark turned and walked toward the road, carrying with him not an image, but a rhythm. The sense of being allowed to pause without needing to justify it. The path rose gently away from the beach. Grass replaced sand underfoot, its surface uneven but forgiving. Mark walked without looking back again, trusting the sea to continue its work without witness. The road appeared at the top of the path. Cars were parked along it in loose lines. A cyclist passed steadily. The ordinary movements of the day had begun. Mark unlocked his car and paused before getting in. The smell of the beach lingered faintly on his clothes. Salt and damp stone carried upward by the breeze. He noticed how settled his body felt, as though the morning had quietly adjusted something within him. He drove away without hurry. Fields passed. Houses appeared and disappeared. The day unfolded in its usual way, unremarkable and sufficient. The pause at the beach did not replay itself. It remained simply as a quiet reference point, a reminder that stillness existed within movement. By the time Mark reached home, the tide had likely erased the last of the pools. The beach would look as it always did to those who arrived later. Mark did not feel the need to return. The moment had offered itself once, then passed without asking to be remembered. He stepped inside, carrying nothing with him beyond the ease that had settled. The sea continued its rhythm. The day continued its own. The pause remained, complete in its passing. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, comment, share and subscribe. Thank you for supporting the channel.